Maybe we'll shift the order around here a little bit and start with Reverend Carol Houle, who I met for the first time yesterday. Carol spent 35 years, is that right, in working in Africa, so he's certainly familiar with the issues. Reverend Houle is a Maryknoll priest, worked in Kenya most recently for 14 years in Nairobi, and for 20 some odd years before that in Tanzania. So I think he has some very interesting things to share with us and some perspectives about what the G8 and the international institutions think about development in Africa, and perhaps some insights as about how that development should really happen. Thank you.
Sure. We'll do that. Thank you, Cliff. As you know, his campaign manager just announced his new campaign last night. He's going to be our new governor. For those of you who were at the evening session there. Yes, I'm very honored to be here, happy to be here with the Global Justice Action Summit. The NAPOD, or New Partnership for African Development, has a long history in the making, in a sense that Kwame Nkrumah of Ghana, at the time of independence for Ghana and independence of many countries in the early 60s for Africa, he was asking for an African unity. But it was a bit early. Many new countries, they were all new. Many of them thought that it would be better to go step by step, to try to build a sense of national unity, regional unity, and then eventually move to the continental unity. And then you had the Lagos Plan of Action in 1980, which looked very much seriously at the African reality and how to build on it. Never got implemented. And then in 1991, the Abuja Treaty, which again had some good ideas, but it never really got very far. But in the meantime, there were a lot of regional blocs or groups that were forming. Where I was working in Tanzania and Kenya was the East African, Tanzania, Kenya, and Uganda. And Julius Nyerere, the president of Tanzania, was even willing to delay independence until Kenya got its independence so they could become really one unity. It would be a cooperative, but like one, much more unity among the three countries. But that didn't work out either. And the East African community fell apart for a while, and now they're forming again the East African Cooperation. But the Southern African Development, SADC, in the Southern Africa, all the way up to Zambia and those countries. And then in West Africa, they had different blocs they tried. And so I'm just trying to say there's been a lot of attempts at this, trying to build a sense of unity for Africa. And they had the Organization of African Unity, which is more of a political entity. It has taken on some more serious attempts at helping to build peace, but it never got heavily involved in the economic unity of the continent. So this new Partnership for African Development is an attempt. Now, it really comes out of 4 countries, basically. The initiative of the presidents of South Africa, Nigeria, Senegal, and Algeria, I believe, with the northern Arab countries. So the purpose of it is to respond to globalization. I work at the UN. I'm a representative of Maryknoll now at the United Nations in New York. And the World Bank and others will give you these big figures from the Millennium Summit that the UN had last year, 2 years ago. And they'll show you how that this development they're trying to do, they're trying to get the children back in primary schools, they're trying to bring health care, they're trying to do this, they're trying to do that Latin America is on target. Now, talk to people who live and work with the ordinary poor of Latin America, they don't think that Latin America is on target at all. But at least from the top, there is the gross domestic product, the GNP or whatever it is, that seems to be developing a bit, and there is some progress. But apparently from the Marinolas I talk with, listen to, and others, the average person in many countries in Latin America is not participating in this development, in this globalization. And they say Asia overall is on target. But again, they lump it all together. Southeast Asia is probably moving forward, Korea and those countries, but South Asia, Bangladesh, much of India, they're still not moving forward. But they say just, the World Bank says, Africa is not only not holding its own, it's going backwards. So Africa is in deep trouble, not only financially, but for health care, for education. And this, I think, the lack of development is bringing violence, more violence, I think, to the continent, and continues, I think one of the primary reasons for the armed conflicts is poverty and a sense of no hope with the regular channels of development. And for myself, even when things were going well, like in a country like Tanzania, they started really at independence with one doctor in the whole country, one doctor at independence. There were no roads for the country so you could get around easily. There's no electricity. There's no water supply for much of the country. The women where I lived and worked with for 21 years in rural Tanzania, they had to walk for a mile or 2 miles to get water and bring it back with buckets on their heads. They had to walk for a mile or 2 miles to get the wood so they could cook their meals over an open fire with rocks, with 3 rocks. And much of that has not changed. Much of that has not changed. The thing that has changed tremendously is the expectation of the young people. They're not content anymore just to live in poverty in the rural areas. So many of them run off now to the cities. So what do you do? So there's a real need there. There's a real problem. So how do you reverse the economic decline on the continent? How do you change, and they say to change the image of Africa and to get donor interest. So this is what NAPAD, the document itself, says about itself. And they want to build on the present regional economic structures. And then they want to put emphasis on peace, democracy, and good governance. And like every document now, a major document that come out, they're talking about more inclusion of women, gender equality, which is good. I'm afraid in most places it only stays in the document, but at least that's the beginning. That's the beginning. So it sounds good on paper, but is it going to really be that helpful? That's the problem. And I'm sure Njoki can give us a much stronger presentation of the weaknesses and the problems it has. But the civil society was not consulted. So it's not what people say, it's not our document. We don't own it. It came from the top. And it follows probably the biggest weakness in the whole thing. And if you've been here the last couple of days, you'll understand this very clearly. And you probably understand it very clearly anyway, but it follows completely the neoliberal, so-called free market economy model. And that does not work so far in Africa. That does not work. Matter of fact, it's brought more poverty, brought more alienation. And then it doesn't really take on seriously the structural adjustment programs. And just recently, for example, in Dar es Salaam, Tanzania is now one of the favorite countries in Eastern Africa anyway, after Uganda. Tanzania is coming up there. They're being patted on their heads for being good little boys and girls. And but just recently, with the push by the World Bank, for example, they wanted with the structural adjustment programs, they coerced Dar es Salaam to privatize the water and sewage project in Dar es Salaam, the capital, 3 million people. And the World Bank and others gave a loan of $147 million so that they could upgrade and fix up their water and sewage systems so they could sell it. And now they put out bids and they're going to sell it for $7 million. So, and these people, the $7 million, whoever buys it, is going to have to not just pay off part of that debt, but they're going to have to pay for some meters and standpipes and those things. But the people now, when this is sold to a private company, probably from Europe, France, Germany, and England all put bids in, among other countries. But the people, ordinary people, will be stuck again with a $147 million debt over which they had no control, and they'll have to pay higher rates for water. So most of the poor people will not even be able to afford probably the increased rates. So this is a kind of a system that they're caught up in already, and it's going to continue unless there's some major changes. The other thing is that what they say, the expectation of a 7% economic growth for each country, if that continues for 10 years, then they will catch up and then be able to participate fully in the economic global economy. Well, 7% is so unrealistic. It's even where a country like Uganda, which were mentioned, that are getting some debt forgiveness, are not able to have at all a 7%, because so many other factors are at play. As someone mentioned yesterday, the price of coffee, the main export from Uganda, has dropped 70% worldwide. And then in this document, they mention it a bit, but they don't really look at one of the real problems of the reality of weak governments and fragmented civil society. And we have weak governments in Africa, partly to blame from people themselves. There are greedy people, people who want power, people who will use others. That's a worldwide temptation. They are there in many countries. But much of that was connected to the Western banks, the Western countries, which did not care. After independence, they were more concerned about their own economic being able to continue to literally rip off so many of the minerals and cheap labor and so forth in these countries. But also, they were caught up in the Cold War. So they gave, like yesterday, we heard about these huge loans to places like Zaire and others, and they didn't care whether they got paid back or not. And they weakened the governments, and they forced the governments to cut down on health care and education. I know after the structural adjustment programs came in Tanzania, we would bury twice as many babies as before. And all of a sudden, all over Africa, black Africa, street kids came out of the woodwork, even in the smallest of towns, because they couldn't go to school. The governments had to cut down their subsidies and health care and education. The parents had to pay for those things, people had to pay, and they couldn't afford it. So this weakened the governments. The governments were no longer credible. So people then they weren't accountable to the people. They were able to grab what they could, and some grabbed a lot. But a lot of the responsibility lies with IMF, World Bank, with the World Trade Organization. We haven't heard too much about the whole trade thing. The prices from the south, the prices from the north, but also the governments from the north. And they won't take any responsibility for their past faults. They won't take any responsibility for being part of the problem of weakening governments, of fragmenting civil societies. So what are the alternatives? I think we have to do both. Now, others will disagree with me, and I accept that disagreement. We have to try to work, I think, at these global economic structures. To say just to get rid of them, fine, if we can do that. But in the meantime, I think we have to at least modify them and change them if possible. We have to modify IMF and World Bank and the whole trade policies and regulations. We have to modify those and hopefully change them. And if necessary, incorporate World Bank and IMF and the World Trade Organization into an organization perhaps like the UN or some other group that will be responsible to the people, not to their shareholders, not to the people who have all the money, not to their really stockholders, I guess you would say, not to the people. This is a problem right now. But we have to work. We have to continue to work at that, and that's why I'm so happy about this forum, about this summit, because you people are very aware of the negative effects that these big economic institutions have. And besides that, I think we have to look much more at the multinationals, at the big corporations, which more and more are controlling even governments. Certainly, they're controlling governments in Africa, and they will much more, my fear, if this NAPOD thing goes the way it was written. And so we have to do it from the top. And the meeting of a lot of civil society organizations and academic institutions at Bamako, they emphasized this whole thing, that in Western Africa where they met, that these have to be changed. And they need help from the world community, people like you. In the UN, when probably the leading spokesperson on the economic issues for Africa is a fellow from Ghana, and Wabena. And I work with him quite a bit. And he says very openly, please, you have to do something like begin to change the whole thing on trade, like you did for the debt. We know the debt problem hasn't succeeded. This is only the beginning, but we haven't even begun with the whole issue on trade. Unless there's serious changes in the whole trade thing, we will never get anywhere. So I think we have to do that. Now the churches like the South African Church on NAPOD and their critique of it, they said we have to start with the immediate needs, the health, the education, the water. That's where the government should be concentrating. Unless we have educated, healthy people, we'll never have development. When we have to make it people-centered, they say, and that's true, more than market-centered. It has to come from below, and I think that is true. And I think we have to put more emphasis on regional units, as well as looking at the whole economic unity of Africa. And I think in this, and I'll finish up with this, I think personally, from my experience, I think we have to incorporate the best of African traditions and history. And being in Tanzania, I'm a bit biased toward Ujamaa. They call it African socialism, but the real translation is familyhood, Ujamaa. It's a Swahili word, means familyhood. And when Nyerere was president of Tanzania at the beginning, he changed the structures that were there with the colonial times so that people could participate, that the government people were responsible to the people. I myself saw how the people were so excited in building schools and dispensaries, and how they spent hours and hours and hours planning it together and doing the work. They really felt a sense this is their country. And Nyerere pushed one language. And so now Tanzania does have a sense of a nation. They are a people. They own the country. And I think so that's there. That doesn't have to be imported. It doesn't have to be invented. It has to be adapted or adopted for each country. There's so many things in the African tradition which I think have to be reincorporated into governance and into the economic structures. And then there will be a hope for African unity as a continent. Without that, if we just take NAPOD the way it is now, I think it's just going to continue the present corruption, the present deterioration of the economy, the present oppression of the people. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. In addition to being an advisor to or representative of Maryknoll to the UN, it sounds like you should be at the G8 meetings to explain some basics to people who are talking about African development in Kananaskis next week. Difficult issues, but there's people who have a good sense of solutions. Next, I would like to introduce Jokey Jehu. After her talk last night, I hope most of you heard that. It's hard for me to top that in any kind of introduction. Wonderful speaker and very knowledgeable about issues of development and aid. And I'd like to introduce Jokey to speak with us some more about issues in African and African development. Again, this is something that the G8 has got on their agenda. And it's remarkable to me that a few dozen essentially white men hide in a forest in Kananaskis, Canada, to discuss African development. It makes very little sense, and I'm sure that Jokey will help us understand why. Thank you.
You don't have a magic marker in your bag, by any chance? Read it us.
Oh, we just follow prepared. Why we have an easel with no marker.
Thank you. Great. So I want to start kind of like I did last night and just ask you to shout out some words that, or some thoughts that come to your minds when you hear the word Africa. When people say Africa, we won't hold it against you, I promise. I won't. Which one is the mic, the amplifier? Is it this one? This one? This one? So I promise not to hold it against you, but maybe this is what you think, this is what other people think when they hear the word Africa. So let's go.
Birthplace of humanity.
Birthplace
of humanity. Poverty. Hunger. Animals. Tourism. No health care. Ants.
What?
Ants.
Energy. Exported diamonds.
Victims of colonialism. Child labor. Child exploitation. Beautiful people.
Big country. Continent.
Push back into the desert. I can't remember their names. But California.
Useless. Desertification. More desert.
Dying children. Rhythm.
Farmers pushed off the land.
Rainforest.
Tuwaldi.
What was that one?
Tuwaldi from Ethiopia.
Art.
I did not understand what the something from Ethiopia.
Tuwaldi, the person, Wally Abiy Ahmed, the leader of the African group that was at the WTO in Seattle and led the rebellion. Tuwaldi, T-E-W-O-L-D-E. A hero. He's a hero.
Many tribes, many languages.
They need help. Genocide.
Strong people. Strong people.
Well, we can stop there. It's a long list, and it's a very mixed list. And I think that the popular image of what is going on in Africa is very one-sided. And in fact, we have a lot of positives, if you will, on this list than one often gets. And I hope that it's because of the nature of this group that it's because people are educated. So when people have these and other kinds of negative images about Africa, then you can see why it's not so difficult for these 7, 8 guys to get together in a mountain refuge in Canada to decide the fate of Africa, because they don't think that Africans can figure it out. Carol did a really great job of talking about all these African initiatives that have come up which really would have made a difference in the lives of African people. But you know, they never went anywhere. And I think that for me, I'm cynical enough that if something comes up, wherever it comes up from, you know, from Africa, from ordinary people, from communities, and you see corporations and you see all these governments supporting it, then you think they have figured out a way to, you know, to make it not as good as it sounds. So I think that this is my initial suspicion with NEPAD. So I want to make a couple points, and then my colleague Soren is also going to be speaking. The program was printed before his name was put on there, but he's also on this panel. And in terms of NEPAD, I want to start by saying that, you know, about a month ago, a little bit more than a month ago, the Canadian government, Chrétien, has decided that his legacy is going to be that he did something for Africa. That's what, you know, this is where he's headed. So a little bit over a month ago, they had a conference, kind of consultation on NEPAD in Montreal. Brought about 150 Africans to the meeting from across the continent, and then had about 350 Canadians. So it was a conference of 500 people, a lot of people. He has put down $500,000 Canadian dollars for NEPAD. This is Canada's contribution to NEPAD. And what happened at that meeting was that all these African people who had been invited to the meeting and had come said, well, we are glad to be here to hear about this because our governments haven't told us a thing about it. We don't know anything about it. We haven't been consulted. We haven't been informed. Can you give us the text? Can you give us more information? And this is really the way in which NEPAD is being carried across the continent. I'm from Kenya, as I mentioned last night, and the president of Kenya is a little bit nervous about NEPAD, not because of what's in it, but like a lot of other African leaders, he wasn't consulted. 5 African countries, the one that you miss, Carol, is Ethiopia, where Mubarak, not Ethiopia, but Egypt, where Mubarak has said some positive things, but then he has shut up. But they're so desperate to say who supports it, so they count him as they counted Egypt as being one of the supporters. And this is what's happening. African leadership, you know, other heads of state haven't been consulted. If other heads of states haven't been consulted, what about African people? What about African civil society in the broadest sense of it? Trade unions, farmers association, teachers union, religious leaders, students organizations, women's groups, environmental groups, human rights groups. No one has talked to them about it. And in fact, a lot of if you follow African news, there are lots and lots of new sort of seminars coming up as people try to come together in Kenya, in South Africa, in other places to kind of figure out what is going on. The other interesting thing about NEPAD is that the African Union Founding Conference is going to be happening in Durban, I believe, in July, next month. But the G7 summit is happening next week. And so they have this meeting happening where a lot of decisions are going to be made about NEPAD at the G8 summit. And then the Africans are supposed to come together and talk about it. So I think there's a, you know, what is it called, ask backwards approach, because I think that the Africans should get together and come forward with a proposal and then take it to the G7. The G7 should not discuss the African proposal and send it back to Africans for them to adapt, because, I mean, I don't think that when the African Union comes together, they're going to be able to say, no, we don't like what the G7 has said. You know, they're the ones coming up with money. You know, $500 million, even Canadian dollars, is a whole lot of money, and they're not going to be able to say no to it. But I think that this approach to African development, this approach to what is going on in Africa is very much the problem. It is, you know, it is recycled neoliberal economic policies. It is recycled structural adjustment programs. And I encourage, I won't go into details of it, and I think that my critique would be somewhat wanting, but I want to recommend to you the 50 Years is Enough newsletter. If you don't have a copy of it, there are a number of them right over there where Soren is sitting, and you're welcome to take a copy. And on page 8 of the newsletter is this long statement from African civil society that critiques NEPAD and says what are the concerns that they have with it. They refer, in fact, to a lot of the documents that you're talking about, Kara, about all these other great sort of initiatives and ideas about African development, the African alternative to structural adjustment programs. What happened to that? It went to the UN for sort of asking for a vote of solidarity. And every country in the world except 2 supported it. The United States opposed it, and Israel abstained from the vote. And it died. That was it. Nobody was going to pay any attention to it. Nobody was going to fund it. It was, you hear a lot, the president of the World Bank, you hear, George Bush, you hear all these people saying, finally, Africans are beginning to take leadership to determine their own future. We've been waiting for them to come up with ideas. Nonsense. There have been so many great ideas. It's just that no one has wanted to support them because they were really about African self-determination. Something like NEPAD that is really very much within the framework of neoliberalism, then they are willing to support. At the workshop yesterday, I talked a little bit about this idea of convergence that keeps being put forward, where everything coming into any international forum has to be in convergence. It has to be in compliance with World Trade Organization rules, the Doha Agreement, with IMF, World Bank policies. When the terrible Africa Growth and Opportunity Act passed and was being put forward, it had the requirement that any African country that would benefit from AGOA had to be, 1, in compliance with an IMF economic reform program, okay? So forget what is going on, but first you have to be in compliance with the IMF, and 2, you have to be a member of the World Trade Organization. If this is about African growth and opportunity, what does the World Trade Organization have to get into it? Why does the IMF have to get into it? But it is this idea that there's only one model and there's only one way to do things. I think that there's a lot of things that we can talk about that relate to what is wrong in Africa and around the world. And what I thought I would do this morning actually is try to focus on some of the ideas here that actually people talked about. Strong people. Where are the other ones? Beautiful people. I thought there was actually more positive. I guess I was wrong.
Waldy is a hero.
Right.
Energy.
Energy.
Art.
Rainforest.
Art was someplace.
I missed art.
And rhythm.
So those kinds of ideas, and tell you a little bit about some of the positive examples that I know of personally, which obviously is like, that much compared to what is going on across the continent, of initiatives and ideas that people are dealing with, and as a response to the crisis and to all the terrible things that we have that we have on the list here. And I want to start by, there's that poem, African American poem that has one of my favorite lines, and still I rise. And that's really, even with all of that, Africa still rises. With colonialism, with slavery, with neocolonialism, with structural adjustment programs, people are not lying down and saying, we give up, it's over, we are dead. They're fighting back. And really, this is what you need to remember. People are fighting back. It's the point that I was making last night, that, everything gets thrown at impoverished countries, everything gets thrown at poor people, but they don't just take it. They dodge it, they fight back, they try to figure out how they're going to survive in those circumstances. So even with the HIV/AIDS crisis, even in countries like Tanzania, where 40% of the population dies before the age of 35, in Zambia, where the life expectancy at birth is 41 years old. In countries like Kenya, where, literally hundreds of people are dying every day because of HIV/AIDS, where mothers are burying their children too young and too often. They're not saying it's over, I'm just going to lie down here and grieve and mourn and die myself. They're fighting back. So I want to give you some examples of the ways in which people are fighting back. Carol referred to the African Social Forum that happened in Mali earlier this year. And, the World Social Forum happened for the first time in Porto Alegre, Brazil last year, January, February 2001. We got to Porto Alegre, and there was probably about 40 Africans at the entire conference with 16,000 people. It was very disappointing. We weren't organized, we didn't have a presence, and the people who were there were scattered in terms of what were their priorities and interests. And we had about 3 meetings of an African caucus saying, what can we do so that the next time the World Social Forum happens, Africa is here, well represented, visible, and coherent. And over the next year, a lot of organizing happened. In early January 2002, 250 people from across the continent met in Bamako, Mali, to talk about what was going to be the African presence at the World Social Forum. What were the issues that of concern of African people? In October of 2000, I had the privilege of being in Dakar, Senegal, where sort of a steering committee came together to basically list what were going to be the priorities. I was not able to make it to Bamako, but the reports from Bamako were quite exciting. When about 3 weeks later we met in Porto Alegre, there was a very visible, organized, and coherent African presence in Porto Alegre. And I think the story of the African Social Forum is a very, very important one. That people are saying people don't come to the World Social Forum and say, oh, well, Africa absent again, not prioritized, ignored. They say, what can we do to make sure that there's an African presence? And I think that the African Social Forum is an example of that. The Poverty Action Funds in Uganda, where with money saved from debt relief, civil society say, we have to be there. We have to make sure that this money doesn't get diverted. Uganda is involved in a little bit of a war right there in the Great Lakes region. And no matter how great Museveni is thought to be by the World Bank and the IMF and the US government, he's involved in some nefarious going-ons in the region. And so the Poverty Action Fund was civil society saying, okay, we have fought for debt relief, we want to take responsibility. So donors, government, and civil society following up. My colleague Marie Clark was talking about how, within a very short period of time, 1.5 million children were able to go back to school, and now the government was trying to figure out how to provide services to them. And that's a better program to have than 3 million kids out of school. So this is another example of where African people are saying, these are our problems and we have to fight back. A month ago, actually, on the 21st of May, I was just leaving Johannesburg, South Africa, where there had been a conference called Services for All, looking at privatization of water, of electricity, and other basic services. It brought together people from across the continent, people from across South Africa, and actually there were people from Asia and Latin America and European, as well as European countries, as well as Canada and the United States. Again, people talking about the struggles and the fights against privatization. The Municipal Services Project brings together 3 universities, Queen's University in Canada, University of Cape Town, and the University of Witwatersrand in Johannesburg, and local activists who are fighting privatization. There's Soweto Electricity Crisis Committee and the Anti-Privatization Forum. They're fighting back. They're not taking water cutoffs and electricity cutoffs sitting down. They have, with electricity, they have an operation called Operation Kanyiza, where when you get cut off, there are people within the activists within the Anti-Privatization Forum and the Soweto Electricity Crisis Committee who come back and, they hook you back up to the electricity so that you don't have to do without electricity. And in April of this year, they actually, about 80 plus of them marched to their mayor's office and the mayor's home and said, let us give you a taste of your own medicine. We want to make you see what it feels like to be without water and without electricity. They had gone to the mayor's house to disconnect him from electricity and from water. It ended up actually with the bodyguard of the mayor's bodyguard firing into the crowd. No one was injured, but 50 people spent almost 2 weeks in jail because they said they were not going to take it sitting down. People are fighting back, and there's, as colleagues were talking about this in South Africa, they they were very concerned. The mayor's office couldn't understand what we were doing and why we were doing this, and we said the ANC taught us in the struggle against apartheid. The ANC taught us to take this kind of direct action. So here is a taste of your own medicine, because of course the ANC is in government now. On the HIV/AIDS crisis, on the front against and in the fight against HIV/AIDS crisis, one of the things that there are almost 3 disasters that are going on, sort of the medical, people getting sick and people dying. There's that particular crisis. There's also what I would call an environmental crisis. In Zimbabwe, they're talking about coffin making being the fastest growing sector. There's so many people dying that coffin makers are the people now making money because they, somebody needs to make coffins. But also, coffins are made out of wood. Trees are being cut down to do this. So there's an environmental crisis that is kind of emerging, and I don't know, I've heard it mentioned by a couple of people, but I don't think that a lot of people are paying attention to it. The other one, I think, is kind of a psychological trauma crisis, where children are growing up without parents, lots and lots of orphans, where grandmothers are burying not only their own children, but their grandchildren over and over and over again. And they're having to take on the rearing of their own children. So those are crises that are going on. But at the same time, African people are responding to this crisis. There are homes for orphan children coming up in all sorts of places. Not far away from where I grew up, there's an AIDS orphan home called Kejogu Mothers Union home, and it's a woman in this local community where, I have something in my mouth, I don't know what. Got it. So this woman in this particular community she had been taking in more and more orphans. Usually what happens with HIV/AIDS is that one parent will die and the other one will follow suit, and more than likely there might be a child who is infected. A lot of young people who are having kids, young families are affected by this crisis. And so she would take in more kids who are being orphaned, and more and more. Of course, even in this country, there's a lot of fear around the disease. And at one point, she couldn't take any more kids, And the idea of orphanages in Africa is it's a totally new cultural idea for people. If you look across Africa where there are orphanages, they're often managed and set up by missionaries. There are not very many African institutions that look at orphanages as a way to deal with that particular crisis facing young children. And finally, they said, look, I can't do it. The other women in the community who are taking in children can't do it. And literally within 2 years, they've put up an orphanage. When I last talked to my mother about this, trying to find out how it was going, she said they now had almost 50 kids in the orphanage very quickly. And this is not kids coming from around the country. This is kids coming from very close in the community. So this is another way people are saying we won't abandon these children. We won't pretend that they don't belong to anyone, or we won't pretend that they're sick and they're going to die and therefore they don't deserve a life. In my very own home village, with structural adjustment programs, the government clinic closed. The government is not willing to turn over the actual physical building for the community to run a clinic out of there. So they have said, forget the government. We need to deal with the health crisis that is facing us. And they're building a clinic without international donor money. In fact, the only international money coming in is when Kathy McNeely and I, Kathy Carroll, had a Kenyan dinner at our apartment, and we invited friends, and they came and had a Kenyan dinner and made donations, and we raised a little bit over $2,000. This is a way in which people are drawing on their own resources within their community to deal with the crisis. And we can name a lot of different things. I think probably everyone here who has any interest in Africa has an example they can draw on and mention about the of good examples of the response coming from the grassroots in Africa, of people really fighting to make a difference. And of course, I think that the example that I gave yesterday of the Maasai village that sent 14 cows to New York to help the victims of September 11 is another example. I was thinking, Carol, you would appreciate this, and might even have the reference. In the New Testament, there is a story of the widow who gives 2 pennies and gets recognized compared to these rich people who are giving pursefuls of money. And I feel a little bit like that's what's going on with this particular Maasai community that is saying we don't have very much, but what we have, we are willing to share. And over again, we see people saying that across the continent. I want to end by just mentioning, going back to NEPAD and mentioning 4 points that have been made by African civil society in a letter that they sent to the G7 heads of government, finance ministers meeting in Halifax, and on to the G7 in Kananaskis. And one of the things about NEPAD and one of the criticism is that it doesn't address the question of the debt crisis. So there are all these ideas about what needs to happen, and lots of statements, but they don't say anything about how to deal with the debt crisis. So this is one of the critiques of the NEPAD agreement, that it does not deal with the debt crisis, that it does not deal with, even as governments are supporting this, it does not address itself to this question of fully funding the global fund for HIV, AIDS, tuberculosis, and malaria. Again, Mr. Bush has come up with $200 million. Pennies, mere pennies compared to the need. That fund, the United Nations estimated, needs to be $10 billion. It barely has $2 billion. It's $8 billion short, and Mr. Bush offers $200 million. The other question is the question of the terms of trade. The World Trade Organization rules, the Doha Agreement. This is the dominant mode of what is going to help Africa. We have the unfortunate situation of some of our allies, or would-be allies, in this case Oxfam, saying that what Africa needs is market access, but they don't take into account that market access to sell what? The textile industry in Africa has already been devastated. People across the continent are reduced to wearing other people's hand-me-down of clothes and shoes. So, sub-Saharan Africa may be offered all the market access in the world, but really there's nothing to sell. And what is the point of saying to Africans, produce for export, when African meats are not yet being made? So there needs to be a shift in the inequitable terms of trade, which handicap Africa, both in terms of the ability to feed and provide for people on the continent, but also dealing with the rest of the world. And then the last point is the lack of transparency in policymaking in Africa. Thabo Mbeki from South Africa, Wade from Senegal, Obasanjo from Nigeria come together and they write this thing, invite how do you say his name, from Bouteflika from Algeria, and Hosni Mubarak from Egypt. And that's supposed to be the new vision of Africa. They certainly have learned their lessons well from the IMF and the World Bank, and we are saying these are the wrong lessons to learn. There needs to be broader, deeper, and more consultative and participatory decision-making in Africa. And again, I encourage you to take a look at the statement from Cordesseria, because I think it's very comprehensive in terms of referring to all these other initiatives that have been in the past, as well as really highlighting some of the areas of concern. And I thank you for your time and attention and look forward to a conversation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Joki. I can't begin to come up with a summary statement other than one of the things that we have to do in meetings like this, meetings all over, is find ways for the intelligence of people to be heard at the institutions. I think Soren Ambrose is going to share a few words with us next. Soren is someone who used the trip to Africa to change his life and has dedicated himself to working on these issues, and with tremendous amount of information that he's puts together in research, and I'd like to have Soren come and share with us. Thank you.
So, I just want to say a few more words about where this NAPAD thing fits into the equation of global economics and global power structures. And I want to try thinking about this from the perspective of the G7. A lot of times we talk about the U.S. and we sometimes use the pronoun we, but I think we tend to get confused then, because we want to attribute motivations of at least charity, if not actual, pro-development, pro-humanity kinds of intentions to the U.S. government and to other northern governments. And of course, a number of people in these governments do have those kinds of good intentions. But I think it's also important to remember that when we're talking about the U.S. government or the Canadian government or any of the other G7 governments, they don't actually do things because of those intentions. They write press releases to express those intentions for the things that they decide to do. What they do is it has to be in their interest first. And if it serves also the interests of the people of Africa, then that's great. But if it doesn't, so be it. So I want to look at where this has come from. And I think it's already been made clear by both Carol and Joki that the NAPAD initiative is an extension of the structural adjustment programs that the IMF and the World Bank have been imposing for over 20 years in most of Africa. And I'm not going to go over again the policies of privatization, free trade, and budget cuts that are involved in structural adjustment other than those few words. I just want to say that this is the next step. And I think it's plausible to look at this from the perspective of the G7 and say, what is the problem we're trying to solve as governments that are trying to make sure that our people, our businesses stay healthy, the economy keeps running, and there's a minimum of political disruption in the world? Structural adjustment has succeeded. I'm often asked when I do presentations, why do they keep doing these structural adjustment programs if they're such failures? Well, they're failures according to their stated intention of keeping countries out of debt or getting countries back into economic equilibrium. Obviously, they haven't done that, but they have succeeded in restructuring the economic rules of most of the world's poor countries. And they have restructured those rules so that multinational corporations, most of them from the G7 countries, or maybe the G12 if you were to extend it to a few more, are able to operate freely and make a profit in those countries, a bigger profit more easily by getting resources out and selling things on those markets. So structural adjustment has worked. It has also worked in terms of political pacification. If you think back to before structural adjustment, back to the 70s, to the 60s, there were African governments, there were governments in other parts of the world that would not have called themselves capitalist economies, would not have talked about market economies in their budgets. Carol mentioned the Ujamaa model of Tanzania. Zimbabwe became independent in 1980-81 with an avowedly socialist model. It wasn't that unusual to use words like socialism without being laughed out of the room in the 70s. Now you don't hear that. Now we have all of the governments of the world practically trying to do whatever they can to be a good risk for investors. And that means not talking about radical political philosophies, not talking about any economic approaches that might disrupt the profits of investors because they need that foreign investment. We have the whole world, almost, operating on a single economic model. And we have structural adjustment programs, IMF, World Bank activity in general, and the WTO to thank for that. They have unified the economic model around the world. It has lessened the political disruption, except, of course, from the famous rogue states that occasionally get out of hand. The next phase, after structural adjustment, which has kind of taken the power to make economic policy away from governments and placed it at the IMF and the World Bank, which have written nearly identical neoliberal US-style economic policies for most of these countries. The next step is to lock that in. When they wanted to lock in the trade rules that had been written, in 1995, they created the World Trade Organization. This was a body that could make sure that what structural adjustment had said would be enforced in tribunals if a country was tempted to nationalize industries or in any way violate the trade agreements they had signed. Now, how do we lock in the whole package of economic reforms? How do we lock in the political docility that we have gotten? We do it the same way we've done it in the North. We make sure that people don't look towards government as a place where they can take power and accomplish big change. I mean, that's mostly been accomplished by structural adjustment, but we start to make the economies not run by the government, not owned by the government, not owned by the people, but instead owned by foreign corporations. This was part of the agenda of structural adjustment, but I think it's becoming more and more the agenda, and that's what NAPAD is about, is making certain that these countries will look towards the private sector as the only way to run almost any part of the economy. As Carol mentioned, we're now seeing a rush of privatization of the most basic services in the most impoverished countries, privatizing water provision. Water in this country, the United States, 80% of water provision here is done by public utilities. But we're witnessing the World Bank making privatization of water a condition of loans in Africa, a condition of their programs in Latin America. We are going to be seeing privatization of the power companies and the health systems and so on throughout Africa, just as we're already seeing in Latin America. Latin America is kind of the bellwether here, and then the big challenge after getting Latin America nailed down will be to transfer to the even poorer, the even weaker governments of Africa. NAPAD is, I think, the blueprint for starting to do that. Now, NAPAD, sometimes President Mbeki in South Africa or President Obasanjo in Nigeria will seem to suggest that NAPAD is the way we're going to get some more money from the donor countries to spread around in Africa. There's actually no money on the table. It's more likely going to be a relabeling of the money that already moves around in the aid game to Africa and so on. Instead, it's a way of, I think, getting some key governments in Africa to sign on lock, stock, and barrel to this model of private sector development as the way to go. And so President Mbeki, who is kind of the key figure here, sorry Molly, has led the way in having his government author this document, NAPAD, and bring together other African governments as supporters of this model. So they're not necessarily asking for more money. What they're saying is, we promise to do things your way. And once we've made that promise and shown that we can enforce that promise on the rest of Africa, we hope that you'll trade with us on an even basis. We hope that you'll go further in inviting us into the club that the Latin American elites and so on have been invited into, and our economies will develop just like those in Latin America have developed, where unfortunately inequality has grown at a more rapid rate than the economies have. I'm thinking of this as sub-imperialism in a way. What we had with the IMF and the World Bank, people finally started calling it neocolonialism. They were acting as agents in a way for the U.S., for the other G7 countries. Now I think that what we're looking at is the G7 saying, you know, we really don't want to need the IMF to have to continue to send delegations and meet with every government in the world. It's a fair amount of work, and frankly, you know, there are these pesky protesters in the streets of our cities, and we're being called bad names because we run the IMF. Who needs it? You know, all we're trying to do is make sure Africa doesn't get out of hand. Can't we delegate that responsibility? President Mbeki says, yeah, you can delegate that responsibility right here. President Mbeki will, as the leading sub-Saharan African economy, kind of take the wheel. And President Obasanjo, who is just as anxious to be recognized as a good African leader in the eyes of people in the North, and who is president of the most populous country in Africa, Nigeria, a country with tremendous oil reserves, not coincidentally, will also join in. And those two together, as leaders of very populous, very wealthy, by African standards, countries, can use their influence to make sure that their respective regions do not step out of line so much. At least I think this is where we're seeing NAPAD go, is that we're going to delegate the responsibilities for keeping African countries in line to trusted African governments. Whether the Nigerian government is really stable enough to make that calculation work out is, I think, a big question. There's an election next year in Nigeria, and things are really starting to disintegrate even more rapidly than they have been. Joki mentioned that Prime Minister Chrétien of Canada has pledged $500 million to NAPAD. That's true. That is the only money that has been mentioned. I don't yet have a theory why Chrétien has taken on NAPAD as his big foreign policy initiative, but he has. I hope that the G7 meeting next week will shed some more light on that. But our Canadian colleagues tell us that that $500 million is not money that's going to go and build schools and clinics. That $500 million is going to go to create a new export credit agency, which, if you were at yesterday's session on export credit agencies, you know is not necessarily the first step in equitable development of the kinds of services people need, but is instead a corporate welfare program for northern corporations to invest in southern countries. This ECA, Export Credit Agency, would presumably be a Canadian initiative to encourage businesses to invest in Africa. We shall see as the announcements become more specific. Privatization in South Africa. Jokey talked about the struggles that are going on there. I think that when we think about South Africa, a very complex country, and I'm kind of self-conscious talking about with Molly sitting here who could tell us a lot more about it, I think we're looking at a country that in some ways is analogous to the United States, a very diverse country that's gone through a lot of conflict, has emerged in a powerful position in its region. When we go to Nairobi, we find that the South African corporations are buying up the breweries and just what else have they bought? They own a lot of the most visible businesses in Kenya now. South Africa is taking on this kind of mini imperial role in the rest of Africa, and doing that politically and diplomatically as well. But within South Africa, just like within the United States, poverty hasn't been solved. Inequity is growing, even after apartheid, which was about as unequal as people could imagine. We're now seeing water that had been provided to townships and so on in South Africa privatized, or at least put up for sale. There are these prepaid water meters in South Africa and in Swaziland where you have to put the money in the meter and you get a certain amount of water out. That's water provision now. When water was withdrawn, I can't remember the community, from an area, people, when it wasn't withdrawn, when they started selling it a couple of years ago, people went to the river instead, and a cholera outbreak occurred in South Africa, directly related to this privatization that killed quite a few people. This privatization that is so much subject of conflict in South Africa is happening elsewhere in Africa too. Ghana is now in the throes of a huge campaign to derail the World Bank imposed privatization of their water system in Accra. It'll be interesting to see how this turns out. In this newsletter, the 50 Years newsletter, you can read about what's been going on in Malawi. As many people probably know, there is a food crisis, a drought, followed by economic conditions that were not very helpful in a lot of southern Africa. That's creating a real food crisis there. And Malawi seems to be suffering the worst of it. There's a lot of factors in that. But I think if you read the report that ActionAid has done, you'll find that the root of the problem was that the IMF insisted that Malawi privatize its grain storage facility, its grain reserve, the reserve that is set up for emergencies so that people don't starve in Malawi. Now, why would you privatize that? What kind of profit is that supposed to make? That's and why would that be considered the best thing to do with your grain reserves? These are all questions that trouble me, but the fact that they did that led to the people who run the grain reserve selling off the entire grain reserve before the effects of the drought hit, and now we've had over 1,000 people die of hunger in Malawi in the current famine, and it's not over yet. I want to start wrapping up just by saying that NAPAD, I think, will probably be a phrase that we hear for a few more months. It will be talked about at the G7 next week. It will be talked about in Durban when they have this pretty launch of it and of the African Union. And I think, incidentally, it's interesting to note that the OAU, the Organization of African Unity, which was a very frustrating organization, but one where all the governments of the continent met and tried to come up with regional initiatives and had a political as well as an economic mandate, is being supplanted now by the African Union, which has solely an economic reason for being. It's basically the secretariat for NAPAD, and will be trying to enforce the free trade rules that NAPAD is trying to encourage around the continent, and also in a kind of telling sign of where things are heading. I understand, and Molly may be able to give a little bit more detail on this, that the actual offices, the actual place where they're setting up the Secretariat for NAPAD in South Africa is some Southern African Development Bank or something, which was the development bank the apartheid government set up to assist the Bantustans that were the fake independent countries being set up in South Africa for the black populations. It didn't have anything left to do, so now they're making it into the offices of NAPAD, a grossly neo-colonial sub-imperialist institution being turned into another kind of the same thing, but for a much larger group of people, the entire continent. I think NAPAD will probably be a phrase we don't hear much about once we have countries signing on the dotted line to commit themselves to the free trade neoliberal model, to say, you know, we don't need the IMF to make sure we stay in line anymore. We will work with President Mbeki and President Obasanjo and the other African leaders to make sure that our countries in Africa are developing along the model of the North. And once that happens, NAPAD or no NAPAD, there's no going back. The corporations will own even more of the resources, and it'll be that much harder to break out of this model of inequity. The greatest danger, and there are big problems in Latin America where this is being done. You've probably heard about the privatization of water in Bolivia and the huge struggles in the city of Cochabamba over that. And perhaps you've heard this week about the huge strikes in Arequipa, the second largest city in Peru, where the president went back on his word and privatized the power company. In Africa, where there's even less infrastructure and people are living even more hand to mouth than in Latin America, there are real dangers that people are going to fall completely off of the grid of public services. And hopefully we will see citizens organizations there unite even more strongly and take to the streets to prevent their governments from yielding all of their power and all of the people's resources, and will instead stand up for determining their own economic destiny and taking the power away from the G7 and the African leaders who would sign them onto NAPAD. Thanks.